the first of the PRIA-logues, in which David Brown and Rajesh Tandon will be sharing their experience so that hopefully it can inform the work that you do now going into the future in some important ways. Let me introduce David Brown, who's known to many people at PRIA. He is currently, most recently I should say, not currently, he's retired, even though neither of us can quite believe it. He has served as a senior research fellow at the Hauser Center on Nonprofit Organizations, focusing on international nonprofits at the Kennedy School at Harvard University in Boston. He was the founder and president of the Institute for Development Research from the early 1980s till after the turn of the century. Dr. Rajesh Tandon, who is known internationally very well, is an acclaimed leader and practitioner of participatory research and development. Founded the Society for Participatory Research in Asia in the early 80s and has continued to serve as its leader and guru, if you don't mind my saying that, for these many years. He's recently been appointed as the co-chair of the prestigious UNESCO Chair on Community-Based Research and Social Responsibility in Higher Education. Let me begin with the first question, and that question is, what inspired each of you to work together to strengthen human and institutional capacities of development in NGOs in the 1980s?
Thanks, Jane, and thank you, Dave, for this conversation. I came to Udaipur, southern Rajasthan, towards the end of 1976, with a view to find a field where I could do some research for my PhD thesis. And the local non-governmental organization there, called Seva Mandir, was running several tribal youth groups called peer groups. And they asked me to just hang around in those villages. I found that these groups were enabled to come together, but not very clear what to do. So I ended up conducting some training workshops with them, essentially to help them get organized better, identify what is it that they need to work on as a collective, and plan their engagements, particularly with the government's rural development delivery system. And that experience led me to look at very closely Seva Mandir itself, and to my great surprise, I found that there was a lot of commitment, a lot of passion about social change, about improving the lives of indigenous tribal communities, about functional literacy, farmers, women's literacy. But there was no conversation about how to do it competently. So I realized that competence alone does not bring about social change. But so does commitment alone does not. You need human and institutional capacities to do your job well, do it strategically and effectively. So that's how I decided to commit myself to work towards strengthening capacities of those who were hitherto deprived of such possibilities.
I know there are some people who graduate from school and know what they want to do and go out and do it. I wasn't one of them. So I went to Ethiopia as a Peace Corps volunteer and did community organizing for a couple of years. And I liked that. Thought it was interesting work. And then I went back to graduate school, which was mostly dull for a while, and then I got into the organization development field like that. And then I went to Case Western Reserve and met Rajesh. And in fact, the first project we ever did together was a project on community development at Big Turtle Housing Development, which we did some research on trying to mobilize the residents of Big Turtle. And then Rajesh did his dissertation, and I was very interested in his dissertation. And I was just coming up for a sabbatical, and Rajesh had gone back to Delhi to work at the Public Enterprise Center for Continuing Education. And his boss came to visit Cleveland and said to me, "Why don't you come and spend your sabbatical with us?" So I talked to Jane, and she said, "What?" So we packed up the kids and came to Delhi in the middle of August when it was hot. We didn't realize that it wasn't really hot by Delhi standards at the time, but it was hot by our standards. And Rajesh and I worked together for that year, and then in the course of the year, got very excited about applying organization development ideas to development organizations. Now, no, I wasn't thinking about NGOs or the UN. I was just seeing any old organizations doing development work. But it was clear that Rajesh and I worked together well. And we went back to Boston instead of Cleveland, and we started the Institute for Development Research. Just about the same time Rajesh was starting PRIA. And in fact, one of the first projects for IDR was a project trying to understand the human resource system of the Indian Ministry of Health. And I recruited Rajesh to join me on that project, and we did a bunch of interviews with bureaucrats, and I was very impressed with the enormous complexity of the Indian bureaucracy. The last page of our report had a map of what policy had to go through, which was, I couldn't understand at the time, and I can barely remember it today. Thank God Rajesh was on the team because he did draw this thing. But the question was, how do we decide to work with development NGOs, to do capacity building development NGOs? And actually that didn't, we decided to work together on various projects. We were both trying to make a difference around development, but how you did that with what organizations was for quite a while unclear to me. So indeed we worked with that Ministry of Health. We did a number of projects with the World Health Organization, Ministries of Health and Primary Health Care. And we did a lot of work with participatory research and the ICAE. And IDR did a bunch of projects with public enterprises for the World Bank. And we also did some projects with NGOs, like Oxfam and so on. And it became clear that we were going to work a lot with development NGOs when Jane said to me, you know, if we keep working with every kind of organization in the world, we're never going to get good at anything. So we ought to focus on some set of organizations. Maybe public enterprises, maybe ministries of health, maybe NGOs. And we decided to work on NGOs because they were more interesting than the other organizations. And we ended up doing a series of case studies of what we called empowerment NGOs. That were NGOs trying to mobilize grassroots groups, much like your work with the folks at Sable. So, and that led to a fairly long set of activities.
Well, it's interesting because very early on, in the early days of PRIA, we were focused on strengthening the capacities of local voluntary organizations, community-based organizations. And the reason I was doing that is because I found two dynamic operating at that time. One was the dynamic where passion for empowerment of the poor and the illiterate was very strong, but how do you organize them, how do you mobilize them? The process of empowerment was not clear. Some people had heard about Paulo Freire and use of experiential learning, valuing your own experience as a basis of thinking about what you can do, and bringing the notion of power. How do you organize to change the relations of power? And for that, building strong local organizations, I thought was a brilliant. So I started using experiential learning methodology, which I had learned from you guys in case and in IIM. But I didn't have any tools because most of the tools prepared were for the big corporate world, and these were under-organized groups. These were so I did a bit of innovation, adaptation, and all that. But its impact was enormous. So we began to sort of link a lot of grassroots organizations would say, we are trying to empower women, empower tribals. But the methodology of empowerment was exhortation, long moral speeches, thou shalt be empowered, etc., etc. And those who are sitting there would say,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Instead of helping them explore the sources of disempowerment, the causes of disempowerment, and to value their own experience, their own knowledge, and their own fellow households and citizens. So it was an enormously powerful methodology that we followed. So this was one broad dynamic that I was working with in the second sort of dynamic which began to haunt me around mid-80s was the dynamic that most of the voluntary organizations seem to be completely oblivious of any regulation in the country. They started by saying we are voluntary, we are not for profit, we are working for the people, for the poor, and therefore we can do whatever we like. And my concern was that voluntary organizations to have an impact needed to be both effective and autonomous. And one way you become autonomous and independent is to ensure that you follow the regulation and also ensure that you influence the regulation. So that's how we got into financial management and management of NGOs, things like figuring out what is it that will enable you to maintain your autonomy so that you are not caught by some regulatory mechanism. And at that time the attack on voluntary sector was coming in the form of Mulal Commission, which was instituted to inquire into Gandhian organizations, because those organizations were supposed to have helped the Janata movement and Jayaprakash Narayan. So this dynamic of how to be effective but yet autonomous And in order to be autonomous, you needed to be building your organizational competence. You can't fight powerful vested interests and not have your audited accounts in place. Because you will be caught on audited.
So let me, just to parallel that from our experience, when we decided we wanted to focus on NGOs, and particularly empowerment NGOs, the downside of that was there was no money for that. We could get money from the World Bank to study public enterprises or from the World Health Organization to study primary healthcare. So we said, well, how are we going to do this? And again, Jane said, well, why don't we do some case studies of interesting organizations? So we ended up doing 4 case studies, 2 of US organizations and 2 of international NGOs, all of which were trying to do this empowerment work. And all of a sudden, around the late 80s, early 90s, there began to be international interest in building capacity of these kinds of organizations. And organizations like Ford Foundation or USAID started looking for people who knew something about this. And the answer was nobody, except this crazy little organization in Boston that has written some papers about managing these organizations. So all of a sudden we began to get support. So this brought the IDR for a month at a time a number of very sophisticated NGO leaders, and we had ongoing debates about the strategy of NGOs and their relations with other sectors, and how the sector, the civil society sector, was developing in their countries. And that got us quite interested in the whole issue of not only how do these organizations build their capacity, but how do they relate to other organizations, and how does the whole civil society sector grow and develop.
But the interesting thing here was that by late 80s, there was beginning to be some recognition that capacity building of voluntary organizations and grassroots groups was important. But what you do is you bring in a bunch of consultants who have time-tested models, which they've used with private sector, with government, internationally. There was even a book prepared by Manitoba Institute of Management. You might remember that here. Thick book. So what we were trying to say is that we can be part of the voluntary sector and yet be working for its capacity building. And that's how the notion of support organization came. We are support organization being part of the sector, not outside the sector, not mercenary consultants, but similar commitment to social change. However, bringing a particular set of competencies which were based on the experiences of grassroots organizations. So our theory of capacity building, our tools of capacity building, therefore were far more rooted in the realities and practices of grassroots organizations themselves. It doesn't mean we abandon Drucker, but it also meant we did not follow him from A to Z. And this tension, of being a part of the sector and yet focusing on capacity development, giving ourselves an identity of support organization, was not a very easy tension to manage, because basically voluntary organizations implied, and the rest of the society implied, you are a voluntary organization if you are working on the grassroots, digging wells and planting trees. And if you are doing this capacity development, well, you are like any other human resource or consultant. You are not a voluntary organization. That was playing out in the late 80s. Here in this context.
Yes.
And one of the other themes playing out there was the relation between North and South support organizations. And there was a lot of discussion of partnership with which didn't really look like partnerships, particularly if you were doing it from the subject side. It felt like you were being jerked around by the priorities of the organization. So one of the things that we grappled with the PRIA-IDR partnership was, how do you act as the support organizations to the support organizations? How do you build materials and do things in ways that allow them to be real partners as opposed to subordinates in some process? And in the course of that, we also got involved with scenarios and the whole set of, how do you build partnerships with multiple stakeholders who may not even be from the same sector?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, PRIA was the host of the first conference that Synergos organized around Asian partnerships in 1990. And I celebrated the birthday in your living room.
That's right.
So take us into the 90s then. What you see is the discourse, the issues, and then how do they feed back into PRIA and into IPR's work, and the work together.
You know, we were around 1990 or so, we were beginning to develop that program of strengthening network of support organizations together, PRIA. And then came the fall of the Berlin Wall, the rise of Eastern European civil society concept, Gramsci was reselected and all this. In India, it coincided with economic liberalization. And suddenly, there was a new sort of set of forces operating, which began to confuse the identity of the kind of work voluntary organizations were doing here. And the confusion came from several grounds. One, it came from, in the new economic liberal context, what is your role? And there were all these pronouncements being made that state is going to wither away, therefore, what can you do? And several organizations said, well, we will do service delivery, state withers away, we will run schools and health centers, forestry programs, watershed, and all that. And on the other hand, the international civil society discourse. I remember when I was in sabbatical with IDR in Boston for 3-4 months that year in 91, I was reading a lot of fresh material that was coming out of civil society, and I tried to posit voluntary sector and civil society. I mean, are they the same thing? Are we having two different frameworks? A lot of that civil society stuff came out of political resistance movements and freedom of the post-Soviet era. Nobody would call Indian freedom movement a civil society movement at that time, though it was equally fierce and participatory and democratic. So, was PRIA then a civil society organization suddenly? Did we have any links to the European movements or just our own context? And this confusion made several voluntary organizations think that their main role is political resistance, political opposition. And those were also the days of Dunkel and pre-WTO formulation. So fierce contestation would emerge. And as a result, a lot of sort of local level grassroots organizations were confused about their identity. Which way to go? What are we supposed to do? The previous era seemed to be in turmoil. And that's when we realized the importance of running a series of perspective clarification, vision, strategy clarification training workshops, which became enormously popular. And it helped people to think about what is their contribution in society, what kind of change they want to work towards, and how they can work towards it. And in how you can sometimes work with the government and sometimes work against the government. But you don't necessarily have to take a lifelong position saying we will always work to service delivery or we will always be a political opposition. So the entire stream of work that we began in the early 90s on clarifying vision, mission, and strategy was contextually emerging from that confusion that this new reality had begun to impose.
And from our perspective, we were seeing this from multiple countries, NGO leaders grappling with how do we focus our energies and think about being more effective and so on. So joining in the vision strategy creation stuff made a lot of sense for helping them grapple with that. And it also was a time, in my learning, when we began to move from a conception of development as a service delivery activity to a political activity, at least more focused on what has become rights-based development and a set of ideas about development is essentially political, not just a matter of education or resources. And I think the third theme has been, I think part of my evolution historically has been to go from sort of thinking about individual and group dynamics to worrying about organizational dynamics to thinking about inter-organizational dynamics to thinking about large-scale social change issues. And I think it was in the middle to late 90s that we really began to think more about how do you intervene at the sectoral level and have an impact there, and how do you build these multi-stakeholder partnerships that can lead to long-term sustainable social transformations.
One interesting international outcome of that phenomena in the early 90s was that suddenly large-scale bilateral and multilateral funders were putting money on capacity building. However, that approach to capacity building was essentially the traditional approach of transfer, one-way transfer. We in the north know, you in the south need to know.
Listen.
And if I can package my knowledge along with a check for a few $1,000s, you have no option but to do, because you also get some money to do your own work. And that is when we realized that we needed to find a way to work with like-minded organizations who had come together around support organization network to challenge that notion, to question that. And we began to say that capacity development is contextual. A local organization needs to learn how to work in the local context, how to work with community, how to work with government, how to work with other actors locally. And that's the primary capacity. So, capacity between the donor and the recipient of how to use the funds, how to prepare project reports, how to get them audited, how to get them monitored, is only a small, very small subset of the totality of the capacities that are needed locally. So endogenous emphasis on capacity, interpretation of capacity, meaning of capacity, and that capacity development is not like you are doing literacy program, but adult literacy program starts by assuming and learning that adults know quite a bit. They are not a clean slate, you will come and dump it. So they already have some capacity. And capacity development will be an evolutionary process. It won't be delivered through 5-day training program or a training manual. And that's how we joined hands to create International Forum on Capacity Building of Southern NGOs. And it was one of the very early and very effective multi-stakeholder platforms. We had the bilaterals, we had the multilaterals, we had Northern NGO networks who were pushing capacity on our throat, and we had allies in Latin America, Africa, and Asia.
And that turned out to be useful, that you and Jane were sitting on the World Bank Committee, the World Bank NGO Committee, and could mobilize a global campaign around identifying what was capacity building and how was it being treated and what might it become.
In a short span of 20 years, I mean, political and economic boundaries that were pretty strong. The neoliberal wave that hit us after the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union came apart. The interconnectedness between the voluntary sector internationally as well as potentially nationally and locally became much more complex, much more woven together with different arrangements and different kinds of roles and different kinds of activities that put us in a place as we come into the 21st century, very, very different than in the 1980s.